Locke claims that the law of nature is binding on us even in a state of nature. Moreover, he claims that the law of nature forbids us from stealing. Now, if you think about that for a second, that might seem a bit odd, or it might seem to raise some questions at the very least. That means that in a state of nature, we're not supposed to steal from each other. Well, when we were looking at Hobbes, you couldn't really steal from anybody in a state of nature. Why? Because to steal from somebody requires that somebody have property. And property, in order to have property, it seems like you need to have an exclusive right to the thing in order for it to be your property. And of course, in a state of nature, according to Hobbes, nobody ever has an exclusive right to anything because everybody has a right to everything. And so, according to Hobbes, it wasn't really even possible to steal in a state of nature because there's nothing really like what we would call property. And so now Locke here is saying that no, you can steal in a state of nature and you shouldn't do it, right? The law of nature tells you not to. Well, that must imply then that there is property in a state of nature. And that is indeed exactly what Locke thinks. And he gives an account of how this works in chapter 5 of the Second Treatise of Government. Chapter 5 on property of the Second Treatise of Government is perhaps the most famous chapter of the whole work. Locke's views here have been enormously important and influential. What Locke is arguing is that we have a natural right to property, that there are certain things that we can own, or we can own things and have a natural right to them, even if there's no government, right? Property precedes government. For Hobbes, it doesn't. You only come to have property once there's a government in place, once there's a political community, because it's only once there's a political community that everybody else has given up their right of nature, and so you have an exclusive right to your possession. Locke, so again, this is distancing himself from Hobbes. Locke disagrees. He thinks that somebody can have an exclusive right to something even in a state of nature without any government regulation or government decree or anything like that, that we have natural rights to property. And so the crucial question then is, how is that possible? How could that possibly work? How could you come to own property if there's no kind of government there to decree who owns what? Yeah. Because today you might think like, well, yeah, fine. I own a house, or your parents own a house, or, somebody, I'm sure owns a house. I own a house, right? I own a house because I got this piece of paper, or this title, and like, there's all this regulation and bureaucracy. And like, if somebody came and said, no, I own that house, they'd be like, no, just go talk to all those bureaucrats, and they'll tell you don't, that I do. Right. And so it seems like my owning of the house, you might think, is bound up with having this institution, with having this community, this political community. Locke is going to argue, no, it's not, that we have natural rights to property. All right. So let's see how this works. So the first thing that Locke brings to bear. So how could this possibly work? How can we have a natural right to property? How can we have property in a state of nature? First thing Locke says, brings to our attention. Look, our natural reason tells us that we own our bodies, that I own my body and that you own your body, and I don't own your body and you don't own my body, right? We each own our own bodies. That's just natural reason tells us. Just think about it. Really? You want to deny that? You want to say everybody owns come on, no. Natural reason, he would say, it's self-evident. You own your body, I own my body. That is to say that my body is my property. Your body is your property, right? Okay. That doesn't tell us anything about how I come to own a house or anything else. Okay, fine. I own my body. Fine, fair enough. Well, Locke wants to say, the labor or work of your body is therefore also your property, because your labor or your work, that's just your body doing certain things, and you own your body as your property. So you must also own your labor or work, your exertions, your efforts. That's also yours. That's you. That's your property. According to Locke, this is the key to seeing how it is that we can have a natural right to some object. This is the key to seeing how it is that we come to acquire property in the first place. So, before we get into more of the details, let me kind of give you an illustration, an example that will help guide us through some of these details. So let's say we're in a state of nature, right? And that means, and let's say nobody owns anything. And so what Locke would want to say is like, okay, we're in a state of nature. You look over there and you see, a rock over there or whatever. That's not owned by anybody. That's nobody's property. The phrase that Locke uses to describe this is that the rock is held in common. It's in common still. It's unclaimed, unowned. It's just out there. It's just a natural, unclaimed, unowned resource, right? It's a resource held in common. And if we're in a state of nature, just about everything's like that, right? You're just walking around. Everything's kind of in common, right? The rock, the tree, the plant, the dirt, the whatever else is around. Yeah. Most of it's going to be held in common. Fair enough. So let's say I'm walking around in the state of nature and there's a stick just laying there, whatever, just in my way as I'm walking. And I come up to this stick. And that stick, let's say, it just fell from the tree or something, right? It's in common. It's just a stick laying there, right? No one owns the land. No one owns anything, right? There's just this stick. Okay, fine. So I come across this stick. And I think, well, geez, I've been in a state of nature before, and man, I don't know. It was pretty rough back when I was living through that with Hobbes. I didn't like that very well at all. So I'm going to pick this stick up. Yeah, there I am. I got the stick in hand now. And let's say somehow, I don't know how, right? But I actually have a knife in my pocket or something, and I start whittling the stick. I start laboring on the stick. I start working on it. And I produce a spear out of it, right? So I whittle it until I've got a spear. So I took this resource that was held in common. I worked on it. I mixed my labor with it, Locke would say. And I've produced a spear. Locke would want to say, because I mixed my labor with it, and because I own my labor, right? The labor is a thing that I own as property. And now I've mixed it into the stick. That stick is now my property. I now own that stick. Locke is going to want to say, in fact, that, going backwards in time, right there, just picking the stick up, that's enough for me to own it. I own that stick. Just picking it off the ground is enough labor to render it my possession. But certainly by the time I get to the spear or whatever, right? Yeah, that's my possession too. The spear is mine. That's my property because I mix my labor with it. Okay, so what exactly is the story here? All right, yeah, Jeff's property. There we go. What exactly is the story here? Locke thinks that when you work on an object, you mix your labor into it. You inextricably mix it into the object. What does that mean? That means when I'm whittling the stick or whatever, I am kind of putting my skill and labor and efforts and energy into the stick in such a way that I can't remove my labor or efforts. I can't revert the stick back to just a stick once I've made it into a spear. My labor, my efforts and energy are in the stick, and you can't get them back out. You can't get my labor or efforts back out. It's inextricably mixed into the stick. But look, I own my labor. I own my labor because I own my body. My labor is my property. And so what that means is that something that I own, that I have an exclusive right to, is now inextricably mixed into that resource which was held in common, that resource which nobody else owned. Well, because I own my labor, my labor is now inextricably mixed into this natural resource. I must own that natural resource. I must own that object that I worked on, because my labor, which I own, is in that thing now, and I can't take it back out. It's in there. Right? And so more generally, the idea is you have some natural resource, something that's in common, be it a stone, be it a stick, or a piece of fruit, or land. You add labor to it. You work on it in some way. You whittle the stick into a spear. Or Locke is going to say, you just pick it up. That's a kind of labor, however minimal. You just pick up the stick. You've exerted effort and energy on the stick. That's enough. That's labor. You've mixed it with the stick. You take an unowned natural resource, something held in common, you mix labor into it, that thing becomes your property, because something you own is now in that object, right? And Locke would want to say that, right, so you pick an apple off a tree. The apple's now yours. You have mixed your labor into it. You pick it up off the ground even, right? You don't pick an apple off the tree. You have to pull a little bit. Maybe that's a little bit of labor, but not even that much, right? You just pick it up off the ground. It's yours. Pick up a rock off the ground. It's yours. You work on something. You exert labor or effort or energy over some resource that's in common, that's unowned, unclaimed. It becomes yours. Land, right? So, okay, fine. So you can go around and get a bunch of rocks, or who cares about that? Well, this is where property rights to land came from, according to Locke. If you work on the land, if you mix your labor with the land, say in the form of farming, that land is now yours. It's your property. That becomes your property. Or whatever, you build a house on this tract of land and then you mow the lawn, right? You mix your labor with it. It's all yours. That's yours. Right? If that was a natural resource and you now mix your labor with it, it's your property now, because your labor has been mixed into it. Now, you might think, well, okay, that seems all well and good, right? And so that's where we come to have, that's how we can have property in a state of nature. So I mix my stick with, or my labor with the stick. I now have that spear. That's my spear. And if you come and take it from me in a state of nature, you're stealing from me. You're violating the law of nature, because that's my property, because I own it, because my labor is in it. Locke would want to say you can transfer property, right? So I could make the stick, and let's say you make, or I make the spear, and you make, I don't know, what do you make? You make a basket. I don't know. You weave together a bunch of twigs and branches, make a basket. I could trade you the spear for the basket, transfer rights, right? That kind of thing can happen. That's fine. We can barter and exchange in that way, and then the basket becomes mine, not because I mix my labor with it, but because you mixed your labor with it and made it your property, and then I traded the thing that I had, that I owned, for it. Right? That's fine. That's legitimate. And so property rights transfer, according to Locke. But this is what he's really concerned with in Chapter 5: is the origin of property rights. Not with how they transfer necessarily, but where do they first come from? How do we get property in the first place? This is how, according to Locke. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, let's say we went to the state of nature and educated someone this far, right? And said, look, all you have to do to make something yours is go pick it up. Basically, you touch it and it's yours. And we have an enterprising fellow on our hands who we tell this to in the state of nature, and he thinks to himself, I got it. I'm going to go around to every single apple tree and pick every single apple and bring it back to my little hole in the mud or in the ground or whatever, right? And I'm going to go find every single whatever raspberry bush and pick it. I'm going to get all the food, right? And I'll have all the food, and I'll own it because and maybe I'll just go around and kind of kick all the dirt, right? And then I own all the land. I'm just going to acquire all the property, right? Somebody thinks something like that. It seems like, at least as far as this goes, yeah, Locke would have to say. Go around kicking all the dirt. It all becomes yours. You own all the land. You own all the apples. And you might think, well, that seems a bit, that doesn't seem quite right. You shouldn't just come to own all the apples just because you go around picking them all before anybody else does because you're kind of a selfish jerk about it or something. Or that doesn't seem. Story doesn't end here for Locke. Very famously, Locke introduces certain limitations to property acquisition. Locke doesn't call them this. He doesn't call these limitations this, but this is what everybody writing about Locke on this topic calls them. They call it the Lockean proviso. And proviso is a kind of qualification, or in this case, a kind of limitation, right? So there's a Lockean proviso, the Lockean limitation to property acquisition, right? So people use this phrase to talk about how Locke tries to limit or set limits to legitimate property acquisition. Now, this phrase, the Lockean proviso, is a bit misleading in its own right, not only because Locke never uses it, but because there's not one, but two of these. There are two provisos. So it should really be the Lockean provisos, but it's not. People just talk about the Lockean proviso in the singular. I don't know why. But there are two of them. So let's see what they are. So the first kind of limitation to legitimate property acquisition, according to Locke, is what we might call the enough for others proviso. What Locke says is that property acquisition is legitimate at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. Well, okay, that seems kind of sensible. So no, you can't. So one way you might read that is like, no, you can't just go pick all the apples. You got to leave enough for other people. You have to leave, and you can't just go pick all the good apples and leave all the rotten ones. You have to leave equally good apples for other people. You have to leave those in common in the state of nature for others. And if you don't, if you kind of trespass beyond that boundary, well, then that might be illegitimate. And a lot of people, you might think that that's a pretty sensible, I don't know, limitation. One thing that it's worth pointing out, however, for whatever reason, I think when most people read this proviso, they put the at least part of it somewhere else. Locke puts it right where I put it. Property acquisition is legitimate, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. It might even be most people. When most people read it, however, their brain tricks them into thinking that what Locke is actually saying is that property acquisition is legitimate where there is at least enough and as good left in common for others. They might say, I don't follow you at all. This doesn't make any sense. I don't care. Why does it matter where those two words are? Well, here's the difference. Property acquisition is legitimate where there is at least enough and as good left in common for others. That would mean that whenever you acquire property, you have to leave enough and as good for others. You have to leave at least enough of the resource for other people to use, and at least enough good resources for others to use. And to go beyond that is illegitimate, is always illegitimate, is illegitimate property acquisition. That's not what Locke says. What he says is that property acquisition is legitimate at least where there is enough and is good in common left for others. What that leaves open is that there might be situations where you don't leave enough and good in common for others, and property acquisition is nonetheless legitimate. Given the placement of the at least, what he's saying is, well, look, at least in those cases where you're leaving enough for others, your acquisition is legitimate. Maybe there are other ones too. Maybe there are instances where you can acquire property and you're not leaving enough for other people and it's still legitimate. That's left open by the proviso. What the proviso actually says is something like what I just said. Well, look, at least in those cases where everybody has enough, your property acquisition is legitimate. That's really what the proviso is saying. It's not saying that you must leave at least enough for other people. Now, the crucial question at this point, maybe you think it's sensible, I don't know, But why should property acquisition be limited in this way? What reason is there for this limitation? Maybe you think it's sensible, but still, we need a reason for it. Why should it be limited in this way? After all, I own my labor. I mix my labor with the apples. Doesn't the apple just become mine? Why not? Locke gestures towards two reasons for this limitation. The first thing he says is, well, look, it's just self-evident. You just know by a reason. Now, you might... Locke pulls this move quite a lot. You might be starting to get the sense of this, right? He says things like this a lot. He says, well, look, you just know by reason. And a lot of things, it's not just Locke, but when people say things like that, perhaps Locke's getting in the habit of this, right? When people say something like that, you should raise an eyebrow. Really? There's nothing else to say? That's it? You just think about it and you're supposed to see it's true? It's self-evident? Okay. Not very satisfying. I think, would like a little bit more, help me along a little bit, Locke. I'm not seeing it. Help me along. Well, he does suggest something else. Another thing he suggests is that, well, no, there's going to be a proviso like this because God created the earth. Well, Locke was a Christian of a kind. His Christianity is a matter of debate. It's unclear, whatever. It doesn't really matter for our purposes, but some sort of Christian or other. So he thought God existed. God made the earth and gave the earth to us with all its resources and everything. So according to Locke, God gave us the earth and its resources in common. It's not like he gave it all to that guy over there. He gave it to everybody, right? It's for all humanity to preserve themselves. So he gave it to everybody in common. And so then the idea would be you got to leave stuff in common for other people or something like that, right? And so that's where this enough for others proviso comes from. Locke is ultimately trying to derive it from this fact that, according to Locke, that God gave us the earth in common. Locke suggests something like that. Now, people have found both of these reasons problematic. They found the first one problematic for the reasons I gave. It just does not seem self-evident. Or you need to say a little bit more than this, Locke, right? You need to actually give an argument. You can't just say by reason. Reason is not a magic word that you can just say everything is known by, right? You got to give an actual argument. Just saying it's known by reason or that it's self-evident is not an argument. The problem with the second argument that people have pointed out or people have raised is that it seems thoroughly theological. It rests centrally and entirely on the idea of God and God giving the earth and its resources in common. And so it gives a theological basis for this limitation. And what people, especially in the kind of modern liberal democratic tradition, what they really would like is a non-theological basis for political matters. And so insofar as this is a kind of thoroughly theological basis, some people have claimed it's inadequate. It doesn't, because not everybody believes in God, or what if your story about God isn't the right one, or whatever, right? And so a kind of theological basis for this limitation is found wanting by certain people, at least, yeah? Okay. And so that proviso, it's good that we need to limit it in some way because otherwise we get, Jeff just collecting every single apple and everybody else starving, and that doesn't seem good. But this enough for others proviso, when you really kind of understand what it means, it maybe doesn't give us a whole lot of a limitation. And then when you look at the reasons for it, I don't know. Well, there's another one. Call it the no spoil proviso. And what it claims is that property acquisition is legitimate up to the point where any additional resources taken would spoil before they could be used. And so what this would say is something like the following. How many apples could you eat before the apples started spoiling? And I don't really like 500. I don't know. That's my best guess, right? So what this would say, right? If you were to eat apples, that's all you were eating. I would think you could get through like 500 of them before, your apples would start spoiling, because apples spoil in, I don't know, a week. I don't whatever, right? What this would say is that you can go and collect apples, 500 apples, but that 501st apple, the apple that would spoil, that you wouldn't be able to use, that's not actually your apple. The no spoil proviso, even if you pick it up, you mix your labor with it, not your apple, because it's going to spoil before you could use it. And so that means it's not actually yours. You only actually have a right to those resources which you can use before they spoil. Right? Now, this has a lot more teeth to it. A lot more teeth than the enough for others proviso, right? Because when you understand where that at least is in the enough for others proviso, the enough for others proviso doesn't really have that, it's not that strong a limitation. But the no spoil proviso, that seems real strong, right? 500 apples, no more. Anything over that 500th apple is not mine. It's in common still. And even though I put it in my pile, you can come along and take it, and that's yours now. It's not mine. Well, similar question. Well, why think that that's true? Maybe that sounds sensible. Maybe that seems right. But what reason or argument can we give for thinking that legitimate property acquisition is limited in this way? One thing that Locke seems to suggest, and that some commentators have suggested, is that the no spoil proviso kind of piggybacks on the enough for others proviso, that it is supposed to somehow follow from the enough for others proviso. Perhaps it's just the no spoil proviso is just a kind of reformulation or restatement of the enough for others proviso. Maybe that seems plausible. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it seems like, no, they seem really different. In any event, that would just kind of pass the buck, so to speak. Why have the no spoil proviso? Well, because we have this other one, the enough for others proviso. So look at the arguments for that one. And so we'd have just as good a reason for accepting the no spoil proviso as we have for accepting the enough for others proviso. And as we were just talking about, a lot of commentators on Locke have found the arguments for the enough for others proviso lacking. And so then that would then transfer to the no spoil proviso if that same kind of lacking in argument, that lack of any good reason for it, would transfer to the no spoil proviso if the no spoil proviso were just a restatement of the enough for others proviso. And so, okay, well, maybe that doesn't seem so great. Maybe there's some kind of independent backing that we could give for the no spoil proviso. Locke, again, suggests something like it, some other backing, but again, it's intrinsically theological. So Locke suggests something like, well, look, God gave us the earth and all its resources and gave it to us in common. And he very clearly wanted us to use these resources to preserve ourselves and live our lives. He wanted these resources to be used, not wasted. He gave us the resources so that we might use them. And so that's why if you acquire something, take it into your possession, but it will spoil, it's not actually yours, because these things are supposed to be used. But again, the similar problems would kind of hound this argument, if you think they're problems, as hound the other one. It's intrinsically theological, and we'd like a basis for property acquisition limitation that's not intrinsically theological. Now, regardless of what you think, so in general, readers of Locke have found something like the following. Locke needs something like the Lockean proviso. There needs to be some limit to legitimate property acquisition. And Locke points towards some kind of suggestive limitations. But so while he needs some sort of proviso, readers of Locke have tended to think that the arguments he gives for his provisos are kind of lacking. They're not really sufficient for the task. Okay. But let's say, ignore all that. Okay, fine. Locke's got his proviso. So you can acquire property And there are limitations to legitimate property acquisition. You gotta leave enough for others, or at least in those cases where you do leave enough for others, your property acquisition is legitimate. And you can only take so much that your property doesn't spoil. Now, like I was saying, it's really the no spoil proviso that seems to have a lot of teeth. Locke does treat these as one thing, these two provisos as one proviso. And in the latter part of the chapter on property, he focuses almost exclusively on the no spoil proviso. That's what kind of attracts his attention. So that's what I'm going to focus on right now. Locke thinks there, and so okay, so the no spoil proviso, that's got teeth. That limits how much property you have, right? I can only collect 500 apples, and so the enterprising fella in the state of nature, right? There are limits to how much. You can't just go kick all the dirt. You can't just plow the whole field, right, or whatever, right? There are limits to how much you can legitimately acquire. All right, but there's a wrinkle to this story because human beings have invented something that circumvents this no spoil proviso. And Locke is fully aware of this. And he realized, yeah, it does. And that's fine. That's good. We can circumvent this limitation on property acquisition. What does it? Money. What we can do, what human beings have done, is they've invented money, right? So we found some shiny rocks or whatever, shiny metal. And we said, you know what? That shiny metal looks pretty good. I'll give you my spear for that piece of shiny metal for whatever reason, right? And you agreed to it because you wanted a spear or whatever, right? And we invent money. And everybody else likes the shiny metal too. And so we start exchanging goods for this shiny metal. Yeah, and so we start using money, right? It also facilitates trade. It makes it easier to trade because let's say I got a whole bunch of spears, but I don't need any baskets. All you got are a bunch of baskets, but you need a spear. Well, we're at like a crossroads there. It'd be nice if we could exchange. You know, I'm looking to sell some spears. I'm looking to trade my spears for something else, but I don't need a basket. Well, if we have money, that's going to be a medium of our exchange, right? So you can give me some money. I don't want a basket. You give me money and I'll give you a spear, and then I'll use the money to go buy, what I really want, which is, I don't know, a kazoo or whatever. And so, okay, look, now exchange happens because we have this medium of exchange money. Money doesn't spoil. Shiny pieces of metal don't spoil. And so you can acquire it limitlessly. Right? The proviso is no limitation to money acquisition. And so Locke is going to say to our enterprising young fella in the state of nature, yeah, go collect every last single apple. But make sure you sell all of them at least, but 500 or however many you're going to use, right? Before they spoil. But if you collect, 1,000 apples and then you sell 500 of them, exchange them for money, totally fine. That's fine. You just can't have them spoil, right? You can go collect 1,000,000 apples, sell them. They're yours. That money's yours. Now you have property and it's not going to spoil, right? And so, yeah, you keep your 500 apples and you're going to eat them all because you're a maniac. You also got this whole pile of shiny metal now, right? And you can go exchange it for other things. And so money is a way of avoiding this limitation. And Locke seems to suggest that this is a helpful thing. This is a good thing. It allows for enterprise.